Okay, I'm so glad to be here with you today. And I'm just checking at the front end to make sure I'm not having feedback in the recording. So let's see, I think so far it looks good. Okay. Okay, I'm so feedback in the recording. All right, so let's see, I think so far it looks good. Just want to be absolutely sure I'm not hearing myself. Okay. Sooner or later I'll be very slick at this, I think. Haha. Okay. Hey, I'm so pleased to introduce to you today Dr. Janet Salmons. Hey, I'm going to check my sound again. I'm still hearing it, Janet.
Yeah, I'm hearing a little feedback.
Yeah, I was trying to read an
You
article.
might need to mute your computer or else have a headset.
Okay, did that work? Oh, that's a good idea about the headset. And you should be the one to be able to tell me, huh? So I'm so pleased today to be here with you. I'm Maria Lehman. I'm a professor from the University of Northern Colorado, USA, and I'm one of the administrators for this Facebook group. We have some upcoming Facebook Lives that aren't scheduled yet, but I'm very excited about them. Two of them will be authors coming in to celebrate with us the release of their recent textbook. And so not only will they be talking to us about the content of their textbook, but also tips for the ones of us thinking about embarking on that process. And certainly that's something we could talk to about Janet today also. And then we're also going to have two methodologists come in and talk about very specific culturally responsive research methodologies. And I'm going to be in the position as a learner. So I'm really excited about that. And then starting in September, we will start to have our first virtual writing room within the group. And we really appreciate the feedback we've received on that. And so we're going to have it open for all writers, dissertation writers, article writers, and set intentions and check-ins at the front of the group, write together, and then the people that want to stay at the end check in again to see how we could help or consult in that very important and yet difficult process of writing. So today we have with us Dr. Janet Salmons. I love her description of herself. Dr. Salmons is a free-range scholar and creative, and that means she's an uncaged. She is uncaged from institutional or disciplinary constraints. And I love that. There's a certain appeal to that, although I'm sure it has its challenges too. She's an independent writer, researcher, coach, instructor. And she is the methods guru for Method Space, and she'll talk about that later today, which is a multi-voice blog about teaching and using research methods, writing and publishing research. And then I found out something I didn't know, which is she also is personally a creative artist and does work in that area also. She is a prolific published author. Several of her books are with Sage, including the series Quick Fix Tips, that little quick fixes that you might want to look at for ordering for your library if you haven't looked at that series yet. And then she has a recent textbook we'll also look at. Something fun I found out about Janet when we first started working together is she lives right down the road from me in Colorado. So we have a goal to meet for coffee, and she doesn't know I'm going to lug her book along and get her to sign it. So this is her recent book also. And so that we met during COVID, so I haven't physically met her yet. I want to say on a more personal note, Janet is one of the most internationally networked scholars I've worked with. And she not only has the depth of experience, but the breadth around the globe, yet she is so easy to work with and warm and supportive of students at all levels. And you'll notice on the methods page, it says, how else could we work with you? Could you let us know what we could do for your constituents, that kind of thing. And they really mean it. So I want to thank you, Janet, for being here today.
Oh, thank you. So what I'd like to do is begin by talking a little bit about the new edition of doing qualitative research online, since it is a qualitative research group. And then I'll talk a little bit about method space and answer your questions. So I think, one of the kind of overarching questions that we need to consider when we're thinking about designing a study to be conducted online, either, primarily my focus here today will be around data collection, but, there are other phases of the study, data analysis and dissemination of findings, more than we have time to cope with today. But, to just ask you to begin by just thinking about what's different about your communication online in comparison to the communication that you do when you're in the same room face to face with someone. And, while I think that a lot of times, what I hear from people when they're thinking about doing a study online, they'll say, oh, well, I'm going to do interviews on Skype or Zoom or, kind of, starting at that point. So what I'm saying is, no, back up and think about what the characteristics, of your study and how they will fit within, the use of technology, because the technology changes everything. It's, as I say, it's the same but different from, being together online. So, I suggest to people to think in a holistic way and not in a linear way, because, especially in the design phase, because, as you're making decisions in one part of the study, then you realize that, some other part of the study, will need to be adjusted based on the choices that you've made. And so what I'm going to talk with you about today is just, a couple of the choices within this framework that you might want to consider. And, the book itself is organized around this framework. So, there are sections of the book that go in depth about each one of these areas and then look at how, how they fit into, that larger, kind of system of the study. So just to give you, kind of one example of, how these decisions are intermixed, let's say that you think, well, I want to collect data from participants, in a setting like we're in right now, where you can see me. Well, is that going to influence your sampling and recruiting? Because that means that you can only choose people who have broadband ability to, digital literacy skills to use, this kind of tool. They have a camera, they're comfortable being on camera. So then you might say, well, how important is it to me that any one of those pieces, how flexible do I want to be, and then you start to think, well, how's that going to affect my data? If I'm talking with Maria and we're, and I have all this visual data because we can have this kind of online communication, but then I'm interviewing someone else, where I'm not getting all of those streams of data, then, how's that going to affect my data analysis? So each of these questions, it's kind of, you have to kind of think of them, in relation to the others, before you kind of finalize the whole thing. So, one of the ways that I, started to think about online data collection, rather than simply, kind of by method or methodology, I kind of divided them up into these three. So with the top stage being, and certainly within one study, you might have multiple types, but, one of my kind of headline messages to take away is the clearer you can be about what it is you plan to do, the better you will do when it comes to having people review and approve your study, because some of those people may not be familiar with online research and either be just flummoxed by it or, give it more scrutiny. So the clearer you can be at describing what it is you want to do, the better, things will go. So with that in mind, I try to kind of create some categories so that you can start to say, like, okay, here's where mine fits, or here are the multiple kinds I'm going to fit together, and how am I going to do that? So the first being the use of extant data. So this is any, existing data, whether it's contemporary or historical, it's, whatever it was put together without you in mind. They didn't care about you one bit. They were doing it for some other purpose. And there it is out there. And, so, you would collect it in, variety of ways, depending on whether it's, written materials or audio, visual, whatever, you're going to download, copy and paste, collect. And here, consent may or may not be needed. And that whole question is kind of a much larger area than we have time to think about today. But, we could say sometimes it is, sometimes it may not be. For example, if I'm using historical publications that are in an archive, then it may be more a case of getting permission to use those materials, honoring copyright and intellectual property and that sort of thing. But, there aren't really people to agree, because it's, they're, historical materials and, that, already, but then when we start to get to things like social media, blog posts, things that are being written today, then, that's where we get into some of the more, tricky areas in terms of whether consent will be needed. But when we go below that line, consent will be needed. Like, there's no variation on that. You're definitely because you're in these kinds of research, you have interaction with human participants and they need to agree to be a part of the study. So when I, kind of moving from my earlier books where I was focusing specifically on interviews, on online interviews, I started to realize, and observe from the research that, started to be conducted, as the technologies became more and more available, that, just thinking about the sort of questioning styles of research was not enough. So I divided into two categories. And again, it's not a hard and fast line, and it may be that you use multiple types, but having a clear picture of what it is will be beneficial. So in the elicited, this would be anytime I'm asking a question or a prompt to participants. So you think of the extant, if I'm observing an online discussion in LinkedIn or on Facebook or on Twitter or somewhere, and I'm observing it, that's one level. But if I, poke in there and, post a question, well, how do you feel about that? Or why did you do that? Or, what happened after you did that? Then I've now crossed over the line into elicited because I'm asking questions. So again, I don't have time to go into the whole ethical realm with this, which maybe will be another meeting, but suffice to say that, this category would include interviews, focus groups, could be, written or verbal interviews or questionnaires, surveys, participant observation, those kinds of things where I'm asking people something and they're answering my questions. But then I found that, there's really more ways of interacting with people that are not necessarily about recall, which is not always the best way of going about it. Maybe it's a very sensitive topic that people would find hard to discuss. Or, maybe it's a really complex topic that, it's hard to just get with a quick response to a question, or maybe you really want to see how people react in a situation versus how they remember. Because, if you're asking me something, and I'm thinking, well, if I tell her that, she's going to really think I'm a bad mother, or, she's going to think like, how do you know that? Like, so, maybe I censor my responses a little bit internally because, I'm not sure, like, well, she probably doesn't want to know about that, so I'm, but if we move into this third category that I call enacted, then, we're trying to create some situation that could be a creative methods using arts-based methods. It could be scenario, vignettes, simulations, creating some kind of problem where, within the exchange with the participants, we can see how they are responding and how they are, working with whatever the, materials might be. So given all of that, then we can start to think about, well, once we're looking at those types, what kind of data do we prefer to collect or expect to collect? Is it going to be visual, images, pictures, drawings, artwork, media, maps? Is it going to be those spoken responses from the participant? Is it going to be written words, either a participant's response to our questions or our prompts, or, materials that we find, because each one of those will have, distinct implications for data analysis, et cetera. So, as I say, in terms of extant data, there's an incredible amount of material available. Just recently, like I just finished putting together a collection of material for Women's Equality Day that will be live on MethodSpace later in the month. And, you can go back and find, the original writings that people did. And, the archives are incredible, and the pictures and the artwork and the, recorded interviews and everything else, it's amazing. In a previous one I put together for MethodSpace for Juneteenth, I found recordings that were done, interviews that were done with former slaves who recalled when they got the news that slavery had ended in the U.S., which is what the U.S. Juneteenth holiday observes. But the fact that you could hear someone talking about that experience as a child, open access online, incredible. Then we have, what I would call contemporary materials that, are, things that were developed in the digital age. So they are electronic. And then what I call emergent, which is what's, all the tweets that are being posted right now while we've been talking. Then, moving into the kind of more interactive pieces again, think about, well, what are the characteristics, of interactions with people face to face? You have a choice of where you're going to meet. If you were going to do an in-person interview or arts-based methods study, you would say, well, let's see, am I going to do it in my office? Am I going to do it in a public space like a library meeting room? Am I going to do it in the person's home? Each one of those would be a very different type of setting. Similarly, we have to think about those questions online too. And then we have to think about, well, is it important to see the person? Do we want eye contact? Do we want to be able to catch those nonverbal cues? How important is that? Do we want to be able to see items and share, here's my, pottery piece that I inherited from my grandmother, and, let's look at it and see, is that important to you or not? Which of those things do you want? So as you're thinking about all of those things, as you notice, in none of those choices was I really focusing on, like, what tool are you going to use? So, what I encourage people to think about the ways that the technology is going to play into your study and the features that you need, and then, decide what tool will be best. So, here, again, you can see that I think in terms of models and categories, partly because I think, it's not that you want to pigeonhole, but if you can describe something very clearly because you understand where it fits, then, your reviewer will understand it more clearly as well. So, these three choices would be, at the beginning would be, the technology is simply the medium. I'm using technology to do these interviews because I'm talking to people in other countries, in other places, or people who are in protected environments where outsiders can't enter. I don't really care what the technology is, and it may be that I'll use different technologies with different participants. And it's interesting, just recently I posted on MethodSpace a story about a study that was done by the Pew Research Center, and they allowed us to share this backstory to their study. And that was the premise for their study. I asked them, well, what platform did they use? And they said, well, we didn't use one single platform. We used the platforms that were convenient, accessible, available, comfortable to the participants. So they weren't all the same. So here, I'm trying to communicate with you. However it is that works for you, works for me, and I'll deal with it. But then I go to the next level where maybe think about that last slide. Maybe I think, no, I really do need to see the person. I want to have that. I want to be able to get the nonverbals. I want to see their faces. I want to see their reactions. I want them to be able to show me things, so now I'm thinking, well, those are particular features, and I understand that may exclude some participants, potential participants who don't have access to those technologies, but really that's important to the setting for this study. Another way of thinking about setting is that I might say, well, I want to study, parents of toddlers who are trying to work from a home office. And here's a group, online of parents of toddlers talking about their work lives. So I might say, well, okay, I'm going to, see if I can get permission to conduct my study with that group, because, they're in this setting is where these people, the people with the experience and the problems and the issues I want to study are present. So, that's another way to think about the setting question. And then the third would be, the technology is that's part of what I'm studying. So here, whereas in the, the middle choice for setting, I might say, well, I'm going to use Zoom as a setting because it allows me to use my camera and see the person, but I'm not studying Zoom. I'm studying parents with, working at home. But if if the technology is a phenomenon, then I am studying that. I want to see, how did they, how did they share, did they have the digital literacy skills to share their screen? What did they share? How did they do it? How are they interacting in this online discussion group? How often do they participate? What do they share? What features do they use? And that sort of thing. And so, as you're looking at the literature and you see things called internet studies, they tend to be, more, the technology is either the phenomenon or a central part of the phenomenon, because they are really studying that tool. So thinking, say, in like education, which I know Maria teaches in, I might be looking at ed tech and saying, well, do students respond better for an assignment using a wiki, or do they respond better with an assignment, to create a blog, or, do I want to use, do they like using public social media tools or private tools? So I'm looking at the tools. I already talked about that. So another feature, as I start to get into the technology, involves the timing. And I think, we used to have a more simplistic view of either you are synchronous in real time or you are asynchronous and you are not in real time. But I think it's much more complicated now. And so why is that important to think about? Well, one is the type of interaction you want to have, what fits your study. And the other is, what do I need to be discussing with my potential participants when I'm informing them as a part of the informed consent process? So how do I set my expectations? So you'll notice that at one end of the continuum, I have synchronicity and synchronous. And you might say, well, how are those different? Well, synchronicity would be where we have agreed that when we're doing the interview, that's all we're doing. I'm not like, say the person is in the interview, but they're also texting their friends or updating their, profile on, shopping, like any number of things that people might be doing online. And we might say, well, maybe that's okay, because I know if I'm doing that study about the mothers with small children, I might think like it's unrealistic to think that this person can just have a single focus on talking to me and, understand that there may be interruptions or disruptions or other things going on. But, if what you want, because part of nonverbal communication is timing. So if you ask me a question and you're thinking, she really needs to think about this, or she's emotional about this, so it's taking a little more time to respond. That's a nonverbal cue. So if you're thinking, oh, Janet's really got to think about this question, she's, this is giving her a pause, but really, I was like talking to somebody else on my phone, then like, it's not accurate. So you need to just clarify, with your participants about, what it is that you expect during, if we're having an interactive thing, an interview, an arts-based interaction, whatever it may be, what do you expect from them during that time? There are a lot of other pieces to that too. Do you expect that they will be on the camera, which of course you can tell I'm not doing something else because you can see me. Then, is it okay if they turn off the camera? Is it okay if they turn on a virtual background? Do you want to collect that data? Are you looking at, like I do when I'm watching the people on TV with their bookshelves behind them, and I'm like going like, what are the books on their shelves? Because I want to know what they're reading, like, do you care about that? Or maybe you do, maybe you don't. You have to decide, and you have to make sure that your participant understands that. But then at the next phase of near synchronous, we might even say what we're doing here today is a bit like that, because, we're using a synchronous tool, but then once it is posted in the group, people will be responding and going back and forth and commenting perhaps. And, so they're not necessarily online all at the same time, doing it all at the same time, but it's kind of like an elongated conversation. So I think, in the text chats that I do with my friends, I don't expect they're there necessarily. They might be there right now and they'll reply, or it might be that, 2 hours from now, they're going to reply. I expect they're going to reply soon. That's part of the characteristics of texting, but maybe not immediately. So, there are really some terrific research uses for this kind of thing, because we might say, well, every day for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to text you a prompt to think about that day. And maybe I have some request for, take pictures of your home office. Reflect on X, Y, or Z. And so we can use kind of some of the diary methods and some of those kinds of things that, really lends itself to research using apps, etc. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have asynchronous. So here we're, it could be email, where we're sending questions and the person is responding. And this might be the kind of research we would choose when we want the person to take the time and think about it. We don't want the off the cuff answer. We want them to really think it through, or maybe we want them to think it through and also collect up some, photographs or some scan some documents, or, there's things that we want them to, collect, show me your lesson plans, for the class that you taught on this subject last year. There, things like that would lend themselves to an asynchronous. And again, it may be that you combine these. You might have an asynchronous phase where you're getting to know the participant, you're building rapport, you're building trust, you're starting out with the easy questions that would not be threatening, and we're going to move into things a little bit deeper. And then we have a synchronous interview. So, or, in the opposite, sorry, on the opposite side, we might have an interview with someone, and then we follow up with a series of email interactions. So, you can mix and match. You can see that, they lend themselves to different methods, but, thinking through what it is that best fits your study will help you choose the technology and also clarify the expectations to the participants, which then, helps you to think about, what do I want? If I'm looking at collecting written data, I'm interacting with a text-based approach might be useful. If I want to be able to see the people, I'm going to use video conferencing. If I want to have more of a kind of a larger group, or to work with an existing group, then going into an online community might be good, or an online discussion group. And then, there's a whole area of, say, games, immersive environments, and, things like that. So where we can actually participate. I'm going to, there's obviously, lots more, that I could say about those things, but in the name of time, I'm going to just go on and just, point to, my books are available, and I, it's also extensive amount of material in method space, which is what I want to just take a couple of moments to talk about, and then I'll answer any questions that you have. So switching gears a little bit, I personally went from doing online teaching, which at the graduate level, at the doctoral level, supervising students, which then, really kind of boosted my interest in the methods and online methodology, and thinking about, what you can do, and et cetera. But then the opportunity came to work with Sage on developing this community. So here, we can kind of take it to another level or a different angle. And this is a place where we can share all kinds of things to do with research methods, how to do it, what ideas are emerging, what are the complexities of it, how do we go about it, then how do we write about it in academic writing, and how do we also share results perhaps with different audiences, with the public, with people in our fields, whoever your target audience might be. And you can see that at the heart of this, we have teaching and learning, because, we just, the premise of method space is like wherever you're at, if you're a total beginner or you're someone who's very experienced, we want to develop content that would be useful to you. So, I really like to think of this as a researcher to researcher community. So, I invite Sage authors and other researchers who are doing interesting and innovative work to contribute guest posts and participate, in this community, so that we can have, this kind of global exchange. One of the things that I like about working with research methods is that even though certainly there are particular kinds of methods associated with different fields of study and disciplines, to a large extent, it's kind of, more discipline agnostic, so, we really have a chance to share across a lot of boundaries that otherwise For example, if I'm an educator, I go to education conferences, read an education journal, I'm only in that sphere, whereas with method space, you'll be exposed to, all kinds of stuff. And you can see from this slide, so how we're organized each month, we have a particular theme that we try to delve into from a variety of perspectives. And I've got the coming themes are listed here. And so right now we're focused on research ethics. In September, we're going to look at cultural issues. Each month, not every single month, but most months, we have either one researcher or a team of researchers who serve as what we call mentor in residence, and they will contribute a substantial amount of content, and a lot of times work with me to invite people within their own networks to contribute. And so for September, that will be Arceli and Safari, which I understand many of you know. And they will be talking about the Handbook of Qualitative Research from an Asian Perspective. And we are inviting their contributors to write guest posts or to at least give us some, short descriptions about, what's going on for them, what they're doing, and what we can learn from it. Then October, we'll be looking at collaboration. November is academic writing month. We always do a big, kind of push around writing, academic writing, and all the related skills and issues about writing and publishing. So I think we'll just stop it there and take your questions.
And did you want to link to the actual method space site?
Yes, I'm going to do that while we chat.
I remembered with the Qualitative Research Handbook in Asian Context, members will also want to know that Randy Larkins, who's an expert in the group, he wrote one of the chapters. So that's another connection with this handbook to this group. And I'm hoping to get Safari on to talk about the handbook sometime. So Carlene has been putting in the link, putting in the chat links to Janet's books, to the method space site. She also linked to a couple recent blog entries we've had from this group, like one on when you research sensitive research, the impacts that has on us, doing intergenerational research. In the future, Becky de Oliveira is going to come on and talk about her research, her recent dissertation with older people. And then something I was thinking about, Janet, given the different iterations you've had of this textbook, and you alluded to that a little bit, what do you see as kind of the biggest changes in online research and where it's headed since you've been working in this area?
Well, I think, one of the things that is interesting is that, when I first started doing this, my first book about online interviews was published in 2008. And so at that point, the question about sampling and, kind of digital literacy abilities to use these tools, were much more prominent. Whereas now, you think about, like, say, in the olden days, and I may be dating myself, but in the olden days, if you bought a laptop, you would have to buy, or a desktop, you would have to buy a separate web camera. Now I have a separate web camera on this computer because I want a higher tech camera than computer. But, pretty much every device has a camera. So, that opens up, all kinds of, opportunities, not only for interactive interviews like what we're doing now, but also, for photo voice and, other kinds of research where, you're asking people to share pictures from their environments. We can get into their lives in, a much easier way than, before. So, part of it is that these tools are much more widely available. And through the pandemic, a lot of people learned how to use technologies they did not want to learn how to use, but, they were stuck with learning how to use it. suddenly immersion, off the deep end. But the result of that is, people are much more comfortable, because they're used to using these tools in their everyday lives. So, they're not as phobic about, the possibility of using it for, for this kind of research. But, in terms of, say, the kinds of decision points that I was discussing a few moments ago, in a lot of ways, those really have not changed. I mean, the main ways we communicate, either it's with pictures, still or moving, with words, either written or spoken. I mean, that's I mean, until we get telepathy, worked out, more in a more sophisticated way, I mean, that's the way, those are the modes that we've got. So, now we have the ability to really, think about, the kinds of data that we want to collect. But again, those modes of communication have not changed. Certainly, like in when I wrote my very first book, there was pretty much nothing published where the data had been collected online or where they discussed it.
Wow, yes.
And so, in that first book, what I ended up doing was finding, which was not easy, but tracking down people and like, hey, like, talk to me, please. And so I had in that first book, like about 7 researchers, I think, and I followed them through each chapter. So here's how John dealt with the sampling. Here's how John dealt with so that I was using the, my interviews with the people to talk about their methods, because even if they were publishing that research, it wasn't about the methods that they used. It was just about, how they found it. So, how, what the findings were, not how they got to them. So, that certainly changed. Whereas now, there is, quite a lot more research being published, and, we're starting to see whole journals that are dedicated to it. Now, one of the things that interested me, and of course, I am talking personally about qualitative research. Method space is all kinds of research.
Yes, that's
qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, etc. So, and I talk about my own work, it's qualitative, but that the site itself is all, all of the above. But in January, I interviewed the editors of 4 Sage journals about kind of, what's happening, what's the publishing process, how are they adapting to the current environment, etc. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is that I, had kind of observed that a lot of the online research, as social media kind of became popular, online researchers are thinking, why the heck should I take the time to interview somebody when there's all this data out there? Yeah. Well, then they started to see, well, might not, for one thing, that data may not really get at the question, or are the people really being truthful, or, can you really get their consent? And, it's not necessarily quite as easy as it might have looked initially, right? Like, oh yeah, just scrape off all this stuff, put it through my data analysis gerbils, go around in the thing, bing, got my findings. Like, no, not that easy. But, so what they were saying is like, no, I said, are you finding more people submitting articles about, say, big data and big qual or big quant data versus interaction oriented research, which on the quantitative side would be surveys and things like that versus, or interviews, et cetera, on the qualitative side? And they said, no, we're seeing much more interest in the research where, people are interacting with participants. So, so that is, kind of a shift. To my mind, it's a positive shift because, I think that it's, certainly there are historical and biographical studies where what you find in extant data might be adequate, but probably you need to ask somebody, some questions at some point in time. That's just my feeling, is that, having that at least as a part in a mixed mode study,
Yeah.
it strengthens it. That's just my personal opinion.
And so when Janet references this interview, that will be in the Method Space site, and typically it'll take you to somewhere like YouTube, but it's housed in this website, correct?
Right. So, this page here, this is a kind of summary page for the month of July. So these were, the month of July, our focus was on research across the generations. And so you can see we've got things about kids, things about older people, and it was also Disability Pride Month. So we also have posts about research about disabilities, researchers with disabilities. So, for example, I mean, just to show you, like, say, here's the type of post that is a written post, but this is an original piece of writing. It's not just excerpt from somewhere else. This author wrote this post for Method Space. So you're getting some original writings from people. Then you looking. So then we also have, say, with this one, this is an interview. So, this, click here and you watch the interview that I did with these authors. And again, that really kind of gives you a chance to go behind the curtain and see, what are people thinking? Why'd they do what they did? How'd they do it? What they run into? What do they got to say about it? Then we also have posts like this, where I will collect a group of articles that are open access. They are either articles that are in open access journals, or where I've been able to, what they call ungate, take it outside the firewall for that month. So these are the main types of posts that you'll find. So usually, if you, looking at, like, say, this would be, like I say, like this is a month of content. And so you can see, we've got quite a number of posts, and there, and here's your post. So we have, lots of, I think, I encourage people to give some practical, useful tips. And even though, a lot of our contributors are SAGE authors, that, what they are writing for Method Space will stand alone. So, maybe that you read a post and we hope that you think, oh, I want to buy Maria's book because that was so interesting. I like her style. I like her approach. I want more. I'm going to buy the book. But even if you thought, well, this was great, but, I'm not buying the book right now, that you still get something out of the post by itself. So, so it's not book reviews, or, it's not like you're going to go to a post and it'll be like, well, in chapter 5, I was discussing this, and you're thinking, I don't have chapter 5. What good does do to me?
Yeah. Two of the really practical things I think for when you're writing is you can go in and look through a set of articles that people around the world might not have access to, and you can look at the reference list. So you can look at these blogs and find a set of reference lists that will help you think about how you want to think about this topic somehow. So that's a really practical part, I think.
Right. And I think, more and more stuff, is open access. And, we're very cognizant on Method Space that we have a very global audience, and, not everyone has access to, even if there are people who are in universities and in faculty positions in universities, they still might not have access to, all of the databases that are available. And so we want to, to make the content accessible. But, what I find is that, even within the journals that are subscription-based journals, there's a significant amount of open access content. And then, like I say, I can also pull things out from behind the firewall that are particularly relevant.
Well, I think we have time for one more question, unless you were going to show us any other feature.
No, I think that's, just if you are watching this and thinking, well, I've got some good juicy stuff to share, then you can see under the About tab is some a little bit of background information about submitting so I would encourage you to contact me and tell me what you're thinking, how it fits with one of the themes, or why it would be relevant to our readers. And so you can see the year at a glance, what all the themes are, what we've got coming up for the rest of this year. And so if you've got something that you'd like to share around one of those topics, then reach out to me and we can talk about it.
Yeah. Well, that's just amazing. What one I had seen that I'm put on my list to watch is they were discussing different kinds of art research, for example.
Right. So that will be December.
Okay.
And that so when we have a theme, then I will find the researchers and writers who are working in that with that method, and showcase their work, like I say, in a practical way, not I think that, when I was learning about research, and, you go to a presentation and someone's talking on and on about, their study and their research and their articles and stuff like that. And you're thinking, well, how nice for you, but like, how does this help me? Like, I don't know what, how do you do it? And, at the time when I was trying to learn this stuff, I was struck by how, even the methods books, it's like, if you don't know, if you know how to do it, it makes sense. But if you don't, then it doesn't make sense. You don't know where to start. And I think that, as I said, of our feeling of teaching and learning at the center, even if you're totally experienced, sophisticated, well on your way in your career kind of researcher, let's look at the last 2 years. Maybe you or somebody who was doing participant observation in the field in another country. Well, you were, but you aren't doing that now.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do? You got to learn something else. So that's we try to create an environment where, even if you're thinking like, oh gosh, I've been a totally quantitative person, but now I've got these verbal, responses to, what am I going to do with these? Or now I've got video data. What am I going to do with that? So that, even if you're someone who's experienced, you still might find that you need to learn something.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, then my last thought was behind the scenes. What do you think are some tips for people thinking about writing a textbook proposal? Because it just seems like these textbooks just emerge, and you and I both know they certainly don't.
Right.
There's a huge process behind them.
Well, a couple of years ago, I think it was 2018, our academic writing month was focused entirely on writing books. And so I will send you some links that you can share when you share this recording. So, we went through in the posts throughout the month. And then I really encourage anybody who's thinking about this to watch the recorded webinar that we did, because I got 2 SAGE editors. Okay. One is in the acquisition side, one is in the production side. And they went through it from A to Z, the whole process, and what is requested. At this point, different publishers have different requirements, and that's one thing they have to look at. If you're thinking about writing a textbook or an academic book. But interestingly, a lot of them, really want to make an initial contact. They don't send me that whole laborious proposal. Let's chat first and let's talk about it. So it's kind of like preparing your, thinking about what you want to do, who the audience would be, why you have something unique to contribute to that, and putting that, thinking through your like little sort of elevator speech and your little capsule thing that you can put into an email. Because, at least the last time that I looked, when I looked across the major publishers, that was the preferred approach, to begin by reaching out to an acquisitions editor so like say, at Sage, if you wanted to publish a book about research methods, then, there are acquisitions editors who, this is their job, and you would reach out to them and say, dear so-and-so, I have an idea for writing a book about X, to reach this audience and to cover this topic at this academic level. And, would you, like to have a conversation about this? And then, because then that way, they will kind of go like, well, we've already got 6 books about that, but we have no books on this. I like what you said about this. Could you tease that out? And, that would be better. The doing qualitative research online came about because I already had written 2 books for Sage, but I was at a conference with an acquisitions editor, and she said, we really need a book that covers a broad range of qualitative research online. Could you write that? So, they know kind of where the gaps are. It's also interesting, as you're looking at like, well, where would my book fit and what kind of book would it be? Is it going to be a full-blown textbook, or, you mentioned at the beginning, the little quick fix, which are these little, let's see if I have one.
Yeah, I can't reach my.
Like they're kind of little short, small books.
They remind me of an updated version of the Blue Books.
Yeah, so
they're very graphic too.
They're very, do I want something that's on one topic in depth, or do I want to write something that's going to cover, every, like a broad, a range of things. So, as you start to think through some of those questions, then looking at whichever publisher you're thinking about, looking at their catalog. And now that everything's online, this stuff's all a lot easier than it used to be. So you can kind of look and see like, well, gee, they've got 10 books about data analysis, but there's nothing about like interpretation. So how about that? You can start to see like where might, how might I refine my ideas to fit a gap. For example, I thought it was interesting when I was doing the research across the generations and was looking at the Sage books, like there are a whole bunch of books about research with children. There are no books about research with older participants. And I think surely that is a particular niche. You think like, are you dealing with, it's one thing if you're dealing with like active senior adults, but when you're dealing with people who maybe are in facilities, where you've got to negotiate access, dealing with health and memory issues. And, that's a particular group, but so if you're thinking like, that's something I could write, not gerontology, but just, if I'm doing social research about, what's the impact of COVID on, communities, well, then I might have young participants and I might want some old participants.
Yes.
Anyway, that was something, it's not something I'm going to write. So, have at it. But, but by looking at the catalog, you can kind of get a sense of where there might be a need.
That's a really good point. And that's a good tip too. I can think of a couple methodologists that work more with older people. So,
and I guess I would just, I'll just kind of close by also giving a plug to, one of the things that you will find if you start thinking about publishing books is that marketing departments, there's been budget cuts everywhere.
Yes.
On things, there's not going to be somebody who's like going to spend all day marketing your book or promoting your book. They want to pick people who already have an audience. So let's say you thought, yes, I want to write a book about methodology, interviewing older participants. Well, then start blogging about it. getting your name out there associated with that topic. Start sharing about that. Open the conversation with other people about that. Find collaborative partners. Have a record a dialogue that you could post on a place like MethodSpace, so that you're starting to build that that audience around your work, so that when you go to propose a book, you can say, oh yeah, well, I've already got 1,000 followers who are interested in this topic. I've got this online presence and body of work that just kind of shows that I've been thinking about this and participating in a public way around that topic.
And I think that's a really good tip, and it's the way we're going to really need to engage as scholars going forward, folded in with some of the traditional activities we always did, of course.
Right.
So yeah, that's such an important point.
And I just, as one more plug, for academic blogs like this, I'd say, look in your professional association, because a lot of them have blogs that will get to the audience in your particular field of study. Look at the academic journals, because that was also one of the things that came out when I interviewed the editors, is that a lot of the journals also have blogs. And one of the editors said to me, what I encourage people is, if you've been through it, that the peer review process is lengthy. So
Yeah.
while you are waiting for, the whole thing to spin around how many times, extract 10 tips about interviewing older people and, get that out on the blog, so that you're beginning to, then people go, what else has she got? So
Yeah.
then you write another one. And then, so when the thing finally comes out, there's actually somebody who wants to read it.
Yeah.
So, and you might say, well, let me do that on social media. Okay, let me just warn you that you don't have any control over what you post on social media. Things you think are private can be released. There was a case just this week about that, Facebook and private information that was released to, in a way that was very unfortunate. I won't go into. But you don't have any control over it. So while you may blog and it's public, you don't have that additional layer of somebody else making decisions about your content.
Yes.
What ads are shown on the page with your content, what, how it's extracted and put into other contexts that may not be what you choose. So my advice is to look for reputable academic blogs to post the content of your work, and use your social media to send the traffic there. But don't count on putting that content in spaces where you can't control what they're going to do with it.
Yeah. And speaking of that, Janet and MethodSpace do have a presence in places like Twitter, so you can they'll advertise upcoming things for this blog, so you can keep that for notifications and that kind of thing. I think that's a really good point. So this will be posted, of course, and if you weren't able to watch this live, as you watch it in your own time zone or the recording later, do put questions in the chat, because we come back in and monitor those and we'll answer them, or put resources in like the ones that Janet had just mentioned. And I did notice that Carlene did drop in the links to the quick fix books, because of course, when we can't necessarily order a book ourselves, sometimes our institution can. Some institutions even allow students to request book ordering. And I know that's different for other people. That's always a possibility too. And of the textbooks, the quick fixes, of course, are more affordable than some of the textbooks. So I just want to give Janet a huge thank you for coming here today, because I know she's so busy. And I hope you meet up with her on Method Spaces and in other venues with all her active and different kinds of work. So thank you, Janet, so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. All right, everybody have a good rest of your day.